Welcome to the channel where American history becomes simple, clear, and meaningful. Here, we don't just study dates and events, we learn English through real stories that shaped the United States. In today's episode, we explore American Revolution. As we move through this story, we'll discover how ordinary people, over time, slowly began to see themselves in a new way, but as Americans. So listen carefully, learn naturally, and travel back in time with us. Let's begin.
The Revolution begins. By early 1775, tension was no longer just political, it was military. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, had been sent to enforce the coercive acts and restore order. An experienced officer with an American-born wife, Gage found himself in a city where trade had almost completely stopped and political resistance had taken over daily life. When he learned that Massachusetts colonists were secretly storing gunpowder and weapons in the town of Concord, about 32 kilometers away, he decided to act. His goal was simple: seize the supplies and prevent open rebellion. On the night of April 18, British troops marched quietly toward Concord. At dawn on April 19, they reached the village of Lexington, where 77 colonial militiamen, known as Minutemen because they were said to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, stood waiting in the morning mist. They did not plan to attack. They were there as a silent show of resistance. British Major John Pitcairn ordered them to disperse. Captain John Parker, leader of the Minutemen, told his men not to fire unless fired upon. As the Americans began to withdraw, a single shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. Within seconds, British soldiers fired volleys into the colonial line. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans were dead and 10 wounded. This brief clash became known as the shot heard round the world, a phrase later made famous by poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. The British continued on to Concord, where they found that most military supplies had already been removed. What remained, they destroyed. But by then, colonial militias from surrounding towns had mobilized. As British troops began their long march back to Boston, they were attacked from behind stone walls, trees, and houses. Militiamen fired at the bright red uniforms from every direction. By the time the exhausted British soldiers returned to Boston, more than 250 of them had been killed or wounded. The Americans had lost 93 men. The war had begun. Soon after, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775. This time, the delegates moved beyond protest. They voted to organize the colonial militias into a continental army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief on June 15. Washington's appointment helped unite North and South behind a common cause. Only days later, American forces faced British forces at Bunker Hill, just outside Boston. Although the British technically won the battle, they suffered heavy casualties, proving that colonial forces could stand against professional soldiers. Meanwhile, Congress attempted to expand the war northward into Canada. American troops captured Montreal, but failed in a winter attack on Quebec and eventually withdrew. Despite the fighting, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. In July 1775, Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, asking him to stop hostilities and seek peace. The king refused even to consider it. Instead, in August, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. Britain believed the southern colonies might remain loyal, partly because their economies depended on slavery. Many Southern leaders feared that rebellion could lead to slave uprisings. In November 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, tried to use that fear by offering freedom to enslaved people who joined the British Army. However, this strategy backfired, pushing many hesitant colonists into the revolutionary camp. In North Carolina, Governor Josiah Martin also called for loyalty to the crown, but Loyalist forces were defeated before British support could arrive. British warships then sailed south and attacked Charleston, South Carolina in June 1776, but the city was prepared. American defenders successfully repelled the attack, and the British would not return to the South for more than 2 years. By mid-1776, what had begun as protests over taxes and representation had turned into full-scale war. The question was no longer whether Britain and the colonies could compromise. The question was whether the colonies could win their independence. Common sense and independence. In January 1776, at a moment when many colonists were still unsure about complete independence, a powerful new voice entered the debate. Thomas Paine, a radical political writer who had arrived from England only 2 years earlier, published a short but explosive pamphlet titled Common Sense. In simple, direct language that ordinary people could understand, Paine attacked the very idea of monarchy. He argued that hereditary kingship was unnatural and absurd, famously declaring that one honest man was worth more than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Paine presented the choice clearly. The colonies could either remain under a tyrannical king and an outdated political system, or they could choose liberty and create their own independent republic. His message spread like wildfire. Within 3 months, Common Sense sold around 100,000 copies, an extraordinary number for the time. More importantly, it transformed public opinion. What had once seemed radical now felt reasonable. Independence was no longer a distant dream, it was a logical solution. Still, turning public support into official action required courage and unity. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a bold resolution in the Second Continental Congress declaring that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Debate followed immediately, and a committee of 5 was appointed to draft a formal declaration. The committee was led by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who wrote most of the document. Adopted on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence did more than announce the birth of a new nation. It expressed a powerful philosophy of human freedom that would influence the world for generations. The document drew heavily from Enlightenment thinkers in England and France, but the strongest influence was John Locke. In his second treatise on government, Locke argued that all people possess natural rights simply by being human. Governments, he said, are formed by a social contract to protect those rights, and they derive their authority from the consent of the governed. Jefferson echoed these ideas in the Declaration's most famous lines, stating that all men are created equal and are endowed with inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments exist to secure these rights, and when they fail to do so, the people have the right to alter or abolish them and create new governments that better protect their safety and freedom. Jefferson connected Locke's philosophy directly to the American situation. He argued that King George III had violated the colonists' rights by subjecting them to laws and authority they'd never consented to. Therefore, seeking independence was not rebellion without cause, it was a defense of natural rights. To fight for American independence was to fight for a government based on the will of the people, not the will of a king. With the signing of the Declaration, the conflict changed forever.
The colonies were no longer protesting subjects, they were a nation, claiming its place in the world, built on the idea that liberty was not a gift from rulers, but a right belonging to all people.
Defeats and victories. After independence was declared in 1776, the war did not suddenly turn in America's favor. In fact, the first months were filled with defeats that tested the new nation's courage and survival. In August 1776, during the Battle of Long Island in New York, General George Washington found himself trapped by British forces under General William Howe. The situation was desperate. Yet, under cover of darkness, Washington organized a remarkable escape, quietly ferrying his army across the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan in small boats. It was a masterful retreat, and Howe's hesitation allowed the Americans to slip away. But the British continued to press their advantage. By November, Fort Washington fell, and New York City would remain under British control for the rest of the war. As winter approached, Washington's army seemed close to collapse. Soldiers lacked supplies, food, and proper clothing. Many enlistments were about to expire. Morale was dangerously low. Once again, General Howe chose not to pursue the weakened American army, deciding instead to wait until spring to continue the campaign. Washington seized this moment. On the night of December 25, 1776, he led his exhausted troops across the icy Delaware River north of Trenton, New Jersey. In the early morning hours of December 26th, they launched a surprise attack on the British garrison at Trenton, capturing more than 900 prisoners. Just days later, on January 3, 1777, Washington struck again at Princeton, forcing British troops to retreat and regaining much of the lost territory. These victories at Trenton and Princeton did more than secure land, they restored hope. The Revolution was still alive. Yet the struggle continued. In September 1777, General Howe defeated Washington at the Battle of Brandywine and captured Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to flee. Washington and his army then endured one of the harshest chapters of the war at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777-1778. Soldiers faced bitter cold, hunger, disease, and a severe lack of clothing and supplies. Meanwhile, many farmers and merchants preferred British gold and silver to the nearly worthless paper money issued by Congress. Valley Forge marked the lowest point for the Continental Army, but it was also a place of transformation, where discipline and unity began to strengthen the force. While Washington struggled in Pennsylvania, events in the North were changing the course of the war. British General Burgoyne marched south from Canada with a plan to cut off New England by controlling the Hudson River. However, the rugged American terrain slowed his heavily equipped army. At Oriskany in August 1777, American forces stopped part of Burgoyne's advance. Soon after, at Bennington, American troops defeated another British detachment that had been searching for supplies. Burgoyne pushed forward toward Albany, but American forces were ready. Led in part by Benedict Arnold, who would later become infamous for betraying the American cause at West Point, colonial troops twice defeated the British near Saratoga. Weakened and surrounded, Burgoyne found himself trapped. On October 17, 1777, at Saratoga, he surrendered his entire army, 6 generals, hundreds of officers, and more than 5,000 soldiers. The surrender at Saratoga became a turning point in the Revolution. What had begun as a fragile rebellion was now proving it could defeat a major British army. The world was watching, and soon foreign powers would take notice.
Franco-American Alliance. While the war raged in America, Events across the Atlantic were quietly shaping its outcome. In France, sympathy for the American cause ran high. The French intellectual world was already stirring with criticism of feudal privilege and absolute monarchy. Yet the French crown did not act out of pure idealism. Its motives were geopolitical. Ever since its humiliating defeat by Britain in the 7 Years' War, France had sought an opportunity for revenge and a chance to restore the balance of power in Europe. To secure foreign support, the Continental Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to Paris in 1776. Franklin's reputation had preceded him. A scientist, writer, and diplomat, he quickly became a celebrated figure in French society. His intelligence, subtle diplomacy, and careful negotiations played a decisive role in winning French assistance. Even before an official alliance was signed, France began secretly aiding the American cause. In May 1776, it dispatched ships loaded with military supplies. Indeed, much of the gunpowder used by American forces during the early years of the war came from French stockpiles. The American victory at Saratoga in 1777 transformed French hesitation into commitment. That British defeat demonstrated that the colonies had a real chance of success. For France, the opportunity was clear. By supporting the Americans openly, it could strike a serious blow against its old enemy and reclaim international influence lost in 1763. On February 6, 1778, France and the United States signed two crucial agreements, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. France formally recognized American independence and pledged military support. Both nations agreed that neither would make peace with Britain until independence was secured, and each promised to defend the other's possessions in America. This agreement marked the only bilateral defense treaty the United States would enter into until 1949. The alliance transformed the conflict. In June 1778, British and French ships clashed at sea, and the war expanded beyond the American continent. In 1779, Spain entered the struggle against Britain, seeking to regain territories lost in earlier wars, though it did not formally ally itself with the Americans. In 1780, Britain declared war on the Dutch Republic, which had continued trading with the colonies. What had begun as a rebellion of 13 colonies had now evolved into a global war. Britain, once confronting scattered colonial resistance, now faced a coalition of powerful European states. The balance of power had shifted, and the American struggle for independence was no longer fought alone. The British move south. With France now openly at war with Britain, the conflict widened and British strategy shifted. Convinced that strong loyalist support existed in the South, British leaders believed the southern colonies could be reclaimed and used as a base to crush the rebellion from below. Thus began a determined southern campaign in late 1778. The first major move came with the capture of Savannah, Georgia. Soon afterward, British land and naval forces turned their attention to Charleston, South Carolina, the principal port of the South. They surrounded the city, trapping American troops on the Charleston Peninsula. On May 12, 1780, General Benjamin Lincoln was forced to surrender along with approximately 5,000 soldiers, the largest American defeat of the entire war. It seemed that British confidence in Southern loyalism had been justified. Yet the surrender of Charleston did not end resistance. Instead, it ignited it. Patriot fighters in South Carolina began organizing guerrilla-style attacks, harassing British supply lines and communication routes. The war in the South became brutal and personal, fought not only between armies but among neighbors. Hoping to recover from the disaster at Charleston, General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, gathered a new force composed largely of untrained militia and marched toward Camden, South Carolina, to confront British troops under General Charles Cornwallis. The result was catastrophic. When faced with disciplined British regulars, much of Gates's militia panicked and fled. The defeat at Camden was swift and devastating, further strengthening British control in the region. But once again, American resilience altered the course of events. Cornwallis continued to clash with Patriot forces across the South, yet the decisive turning point came in early 1781 at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. There, American forces executed a carefully planned defense and achieved a stunning victory over the British. The defeat at Cowpens weakened British strength and morale and forced Cornwallis into a difficult pursuit through North Carolina. The chase that followed was exhausting and inconclusive. Cornwallis marched his troops across harsh terrain, hoping to crush the remaining American forces, but the campaign drained his army without delivering a final blow. Frustrated and seeking a more decisive advantage, Cornwallis turned his attention northward. He moved into Virginia, believing he could strike a final, crushing blow to the rebellion there. Instead, his decision would lead him toward the last great confrontation of the war.
Victory and Independence. In July 1780, France deepened its commitment to the American cause. King Louis XVI dispatched an expeditionary force of 6,000 seasoned soldiers under the command of the Comte Jean de Rochambeau. Their arrival brought not only reinforcements, but also renewed confidence. At sea, the French fleet intensified its operations, harassing British shipping and preventing the resupply and reinforcement of British troops stationed in Virginia. The war was no longer a scattered colonial struggle. It had become a coordinated international campaign. Through the summer and early autumn of 1781, French and American forces maneuvered carefully against General Cornwallis. Together, their combined armies and navies numbered roughly 18,000 men. Cornwallis eventually fortified his position at Yorktown, a small port town near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, expecting support from the British Navy. Instead, the French fleet blocked the bay, cutting off escape by sea, while American and French troops surrounded the town by land. Trapped and heavily bombarded, Cornwallis found his position untenable. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his army of approximately 8,000 British soldiers. The surrender at Yorktown marked the decisive military blow of the war, though it did not formally end the conflict. Fighting would continue sporadically for nearly 2 more years. Yet political momentum in Britain shifted rapidly. A new British government, recognizing the futility of continuing the struggle, opened peace negotiations in Paris in early 1782. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, who skillfully negotiated the terms. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. It formally recognized the independence, freedom, and sovereignty of the 13 former colonies. The new United States stretched westward to the Mississippi River, northward to Canada, and southward to Florida, which was returned to Spain. The vision expressed years earlier by Richard Henry Lee, that the colonies were and of right ought to be free and independent states, had at last become reality. Yet victory brought new challenges. Independence had been secured on the battlefield and acknowledged by treaty, but the task that remained was perhaps even greater: to unite 13 diverse states into a single, stable nation. The revolution had ended. The work of building a republic had only just begun.
The significance of the American Revolution. The significance of the American Revolution reached far beyond the shores of North America. Across Europe, political thinkers and reformers watched closely as a colonial rebellion transformed itself into a functioning republic. Idealistic figures such as Tadeusz Kościuszko, Friedrich von Steuben, and Marquis de Lafayette joined the American struggle not merely as soldiers, but as believers in liberal reform. They saw in the revolution principles they hoped to carry back to their own homelands. The revolution strengthened belief in natural rights throughout the Western world and reinforced Enlightenment criticisms of an old order built on hereditary monarchy and established churches. In this sense, it served as a precursor to the French Revolution. Yet the American experience differed sharply from the upheaval that later engulfed France. The American Revolution lacked the same scale of violence and internal chaos, in part because it unfolded within a society that was already deeply influenced by liberal traditions. The intellectual foundations of the revolution are often described as a triumph of the social contract and natural rights philosophy of John Locke. Indeed, Locke's arguments that governments derive authority from the consent of the governed and exist to protect life, liberty, and property were central to American political thought. But this explanation alone oversimplifies the story. Long before Locke's ideas became widely circulated, Calvinist and dissenting Protestant traditions in the colonies, carried by Pilgrims and Puritans, had emphasized covenant theology, self-governing communities, and moral responsibility. Both Lockean rationalism and Protestant religious conviction nurtured compatible strands of liberalism in British North America. Some scholars have also emphasized the role of republicanism. Republican thinkers did not reject natural rights, but they stressed that liberty could survive only if citizens and leaders cultivated virtue, discipline, and a strong sense of communal duty. In this view, excessive focus on individual happiness could appear selfish. For a time, Republican ideals seemed to rival natural rights as the dominant theme of the revolution. Yet modern historians generally conclude that the two philosophies were not opposites. To many 18th century Americans, they were complementary, two sides of the same intellectual coin. Revolutions elsewhere often unleashed sweeping social upheaval and widespread violence. By comparison, the American Revolution was relatively restrained. Approximately 100,000 Loyalists left the new nation. Some were wealthy elites whose estates were confiscated. Others were ordinary people who remained loyal to the crown. Most departed voluntarily rather than under direct compulsion. The revolution did not radically overturn American society, but it did deepen and formalize its liberal character. In states such as New York and the Carolinas, large Loyalist estates were broken up and redistributed. The Anglican Church lost its privileged status in many areas. Executive officials at both state and national levels became elected rather than appointed. Ideas of individual freedom and political participation spread more widely and became embedded in public life. Yet continuity outweighed disruption. Social structures remained largely intact. Property rights were generally respected. Most Americans continued their daily lives with relative stability. The revolution had transformed political authority and affirmed powerful ideals, but it had not destroyed the social foundations of the society from which it emerged. The struggle for independence reshaped governance and political culture, while leaving much of everyday life remarkably unchanged.